that we're born in sin is a hideous idea.
It's a very unpleasant idea.
And the Bible would be an appalling thing to do.
Dawkins is an evolutionary scientist, and he is most well known for being pro-atheist, or at the very least, anti-religion. And in this video, I'm going to focus on 5 different moments in his public discourse that I'm going to dissect and see if I can read something between the lines that speaks a little bit more to his worldview.
The notion of sacrifice, as you say, it goes right through the Old Testament and the New Testament. The sacrifice of Isaac or Ishmael by Abraham and the sacrifice of Jesus is the same idea. I think it's a very unpleasant idea, by the way.
All world traditions seem to indicate that there is something redemptive about suffering, or at the very least, there is something universal. In Buddhist and Eastern traditions, there is a very specific doctrine on how to navigate suffering in our life with practices. If you look at indigenous practices in North America, the Lakota, for instance, they embrace suffering in certain rituals that are made as offerings of gratitude and appreciation. Of course, Christianity's sole story of Jesus Christ is emphasizing the redemptive value of sacrifice as well. And so there's these wisdom traditions that seem to indicate there is value in suffering, not unnecessary suffering, but the suffering that is very real and part of our life. Now, what Dawkins and one of his fellow new atheists, Sam Harris, have in common is a belief around atheism that essentially strips the world of redemptive suffering. When Dawkins says that it's a very unpleasant idea, the implication for him, and to some degree also for Sam Harris, is avoid all suffering. Avoid things that are uncomfortable. I think we can all agree that nobody wants additional suffering in life. But one thing that is problematic in Dawkins's worldview is if you strip the meaning of suffering, then it becomes something that is meaningless, and it is something to be avoided at all costs, which is a very different frame of reference in life than for someone who accepts suffering will be a part of their life and they can create meaning as a result. This is in stark contrast from Arthur C. Brooks, who is a self-professed Catholic, but he's also a Harvard researcher, and this is what he has to say about suffering.
Suffering is incredibly sacred, but you can't see that until you understand how the Stoics actually conceived of this and wrote about it really eloquently. You must suffer, and you must embrace that suffering.
Truthfully, you don't need a religion to have a redemptive view of suffering. The Stoics believed that there was positive attributes to suffering.
The idea that we're born in sin is a hideous idea. The idea that the only way to be saved from sin and the wages of sin is Jesus' death is a hideous idea. And I don't think it's one that Jesus himself ever put forward, is it? I think he probably would be rather shocked at that thought.
I think I understand what Dawkins has a problem here. The idea that a baby, a child, an innocent child would be born into the world with sin seems hard to swallow. And in fact, if we look at some of the worst humans in the 20th century, someone like Hitler even, we can still trace back their life to a child that was innocent and naive in some way. So I personally reject this notion of original sin that comes with Christianity. But more likely, what this is speaking to is a Jungian philosophy, something like the shadow, something about how our capacity for sin, for behaving in our own self-interest is high from the moment we come into this earth. Now that is a kind of metaphorical relationship to sin that I can get behind. It makes sense that humans all have the capacity, and in that interview, Alex O'Connor does press Dawkins on that specific point. Perhaps a more subtle component of this conversation with original sin is the fact that Dawkins himself doesn't believe that Jesus would have said anything about original sin. If we look at Jesus' time on the cross, he says, "God, why have you forsaken me?" And it's clear there is an element of his humanness that's present. And what I find so unique about Dawkins' perspective is that it's clear he values and appreciates the wisdom in the story of Christ himself, even as he rejects certain other doctrines like original sin.
It's obviously something that still interests you.
Certainly.
Talking about, sin and things like that. I cannot imagine spending 3 years. How did you stand it?
In this third clip, Dawkins is specifically asking O'Connor how he studied theology at Oxford University, and it betrays Dawkins's perspective on the whole. It's clear that he has a certain disdain for studying Christianity, studying the theology, and this means Dawkins won't really be able to see many of the symbolic or wisdom-based benefits of this world religion. He's seemingly closed off altogether. But more importantly, Dawkins is actually using this question to subconsciously or consciously not answer Alex O'Connor's.
The thing about science is that it's universal. It is not local. It's not tied to any particular tribe or group of people or time in history. It's what you discover in science is universal and timeless.
Now we see Dawkins betray himself to his true higher power, which is science. The capital S science that has become a religion is something that Dawkins clearly buys into hook, line, and sinker. In Rupert Sheldrake's book, The Science Delusion, he lays out all of the ways in which science is flawed, and there are many assumptions that we make as a scientific community that don't necessarily pan out under further scrutiny. Now, that's not to say that God in the Christian or Semitic form is the answer if science is flawed, but it is to suggest that the religion of science is fallible. And if it's fallible, it means there are things we don't currently know. When I see signs that say, "We believe in science" or "Trust the science," does it not seem to you, it does to me, that there's a certain higher power that's being invoked?
I don't believe in God. I believe in science.
Let's grant the faint praise, but that has nothing to do with the truth value. And what I care about is the truth value. I see no truth value in the claims of Christianity, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the miracles. Do you believe in any of those?
Dawkins seems to repetitively use a strategy of asking questions about truth claims to avoid answering other questions. He changes the topic with these literal biblical questions. And it's very clear that Jordan Peterson doesn't believe everything literally in the Bible. I don't believe everything in the Bible. But what Jordan Peterson is trying to get at, and what I would suggest is valuable, are some of the symbolic, some of the inspirational, some of the truth in non-material terms. But Dawkins can't seem to get out of his literalist lens, and either that's an incredibly strong worldview of his, or it's just a way for him to ask gotcha questions or try and enter a debate looking to be right. What's worse is that clearly Dawkins has a good view of Jesus Christ himself. Here's another quote of him speaking highly of the Sermon on the Mount.
Setting aside Jesus's emphasis on loving your neighbor, which is very nice. The Sermon on the Mount is very nice.
All right, y'all, that's it from me. I hope this has provided a few insights into how Richard Dawkins thinks. If you are someone who's a proponent of Dawkins, feel free to leave your comments and rejection of my perspective below. If you're someone who dislikes Dawkins for whatever reason, then consider this ammunition, but I invite you not to use it as such. It's just a critique of a public figure who's got a public discourse. See you next time. If you liked this video, I think you're going to like this one.